Imagine this for a moment. You're managing a portfolio, watching the global markets like a hawk. One of your biggest concerns? China, the world's second largest economy. Now picture this. Overnight, China stops releasing unemployment data. Foreign direct investment numbers? Gone. Manufacturing figures? Nowhere to be found. Silence. Total blackout. That's not just a red flag. That's the siren blaring. Because when a superpower goes dark, it doesn't just raise eyebrows. It shakes confidence. It makes the most seasoned investors pause. It forces entire industries to reevaluate where and how they do business. And it leaves ordinary people like us wondering, what's really going on behind the curtain? In this video, we're diving deep into exactly that. We'll start with Donald Trump's bold stance on tariffs, why he refused to lift them, and whether this tough love approach toward China is a masterstroke or just political theater. Then, we'll unpack what China's economic blackout really means. What does it say when a nation won't share its numbers? And more importantly, what are they trying to hide? We'll look at the reality on the ground, crumbling exports, factory slowdowns, and the ripple effect hitting everything from Silicon Valley to soybean farms. But it's not just numbers, it's people. The growing unrest inside China due to unemployment, the protests that never make the headlines, and the eerie silence that follows them. And then there's the long-term structural issue, inequality, the imbalance between urban prosperity and rural stagnation, the failed efforts to shift from exports to domestic consumption, the cracks in the foundation that many economists have warned about for years. All of this is setting the stage for something global. The threat of China flooding international markets with cheap goods, a desperate move to prop up a weakening economy. If you've run a small business in the US, you know how that story plays out. But this isn't just about China. This is about us, the US economy, American workers, and the future of global stability. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this moment isn't just another headline, it's a turning point. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we paid closer attention. Let's begin. What if a trade war wasn't really about trade? That's the question that kept echoing in my mind as I looked deeper into Trump's refusal to lift tariffs on China. On the surface, it might seem like classic brinkmanship, tough talk, political posturing. But underneath it all, there's something bigger at play, something strategic, something personal. Let's go back to the beginning. In 2018, the Trump administration slapped tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, steel, machinery, electronics, even everyday items like furniture and clothing. The idea was simple: force China to play fair by making their goods more expensive in the US, and by extension, protect American industries. And when asked why he wouldn't lift those tariffs, even years later, Trump doubled down. He said, "China needs us more than we need them." Now that might sound like a slogan, but there's real logic behind it. Think about it. The United States isn't just another customer. We're China's biggest export market. Our consumer base, tens of millions of Americans with spending power, fuels a huge portion of their manufacturing sector. Take away access to that market, and you apply pressure not just to China's economy, but to its political system. Look at Apple, for instance. While the company designs its products here in the US, much of the assembly happens in China. But those same factories also depend on Apple to keep workers employed. When US demand dips, say during a tariff-induced slowdown, factories go quiet and unrest starts to brew. Or take soybeans. American farmers were hit hard by Chinese retaliation tariffs. But at the same time, China struggled to replace U.S. agricultural imports at scale. Countries like Brazil stepped in, but the global supply chain shifted, and neither side came out unscathed. From my perspective, the tariff strategy wasn't just about economics. It was psychological warfare. Trump bet on one thing, that U.S. consumers held more power than they realized. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't wrong. Now that doesn't mean it was a flawless strategy. It hurt American exporters. Prices rose. Some industries suffered. But when you zoom out and look at the broader picture, especially now as China hides its economic data, the pressure campaign seems to have struck a nerve. The question is, was it sustainable? And that brings us to something even more unsettling. What happens when a global superpower goes radio silent? Let's talk about China's decision to stop sharing key economic data, and why that silence is more revealing than any press release. What happens when the numbers disappear? You walk into a bank, ask for a loan, and the manager says, "We're not showing our books right now." Would you trust them? That's exactly what's happening on a global scale. And the bank, in this case, is China. In 23, China stopped publishing key economic indicators like youth unemployment, foreign direct investment, and local government debt data. Just gone. Vanished from official reports. No explanations, no alternatives, just silence. Now let's pause for a moment. Why would the world's second largest economy, one that relies so heavily on global trade and foreign confidence, choose to hide its numbers? The answer is both simple and troubling. The truth is likely worse than the perception. We already know that youth unemployment was hitting record highs, reportedly over 20%, and foreign investment drying up. A growing number of multinationals, from Apple suppliers to German automakers, have quietly begun diversifying away from China, shifting parts of their supply chains to Vietnam, India, or Mexico. By pulling the plug on the data, China isn't solving the problem. It's covering the bruise. And here's where history starts whispering in our ears. Authoritarian regimes often follow a familiar playbook. The Soviet Union in its later years, Venezuela under Chavez, both began suppressing unfavorable statistics when the economy took a hit. It's an old trick. Control the narrative, and maybe you can control the panic. But in our interconnected world, opacity does the opposite. When investors don't have numbers, they assume the worst. Confidence falters. Money moves. And ironically, the very instability China fears becomes more likely. Now, I'll admit, as someone who's spent years watching global markets, this shift genuinely worries me. Because while numbers don't always tell the full story, they are guardrails. They allow us, governments, companies, even you and me, to make informed decisions. Without them, we're all flying blind. I've spoken to folks in the finance world, people who've invested in China for decades, and they're telling me we just don't know what's real anymore. And when trust breaks, capital flees. But here's the part that really gets me. The silence itself is a signal. It's telling us that the internal pressure is real, that the leadership is nervous, that maybe, just maybe, the economic engine isn't running as smoothly as they want the world to believe. So what are the consequences of that pressure? Let's turn to the factory floor, where China's export machine is slowing, and why it's more than just a supply chain issue. What does an economic slowdown look like from the inside? Not from Wall Street charts, but from the shipping docks of Shenzhen, or the warehouses of Ohio. Let's start with the big picture. In 2020, China's exports dropped by nearly 13% year over year, the sharpest decline since the early days of the pandemic. That's not just a hiccup, it's a signal. Manufacturing hubs from Guangdong to Zhejiang are reporting shutdowns, layoffs, and idle machines. Take electronics, one of China's crown jewel sectors. Factories that used to run 24/7 are now operating at half capacity. Demand from the West has softened, yes, but there's more to the story. Tariffs, rising wages, and uncertain regulation are pushing brands to move out. Apple, for instance, now manufactures more iPhones in India than ever before. And the ripple effect reaches us too. I recently spoke with a small business owner in Indiana who sells aftermarket auto parts. For years, his inventory came straight from a supplier in Guangzhou. It was seamless, he said. Cheap, fast, reliable. Now, delays, price hikes, unreliable fulfillment. His backup supplier is in Vietnam now. More expensive, but more stable. He shrugged and said, "At least I know they're not hiding their numbers." That comment stuck with me because it reminds us that the damage isn't abstract. It's felt by people trying to run honest businesses, whether you're in Beijing or Baltimore. In Southeast Asia, this downturn is triggering opportunity. Vietnam and Malaysia are both reporting double-digit growth in foreign manufacturing investment. These aren't just alternatives. They're becoming the new defaults. But let's not romanticize it either. The reshuffling of global supply chains is messy. It's not overnight. Jobs disappear in one place before they show up in another. And while China may be slowing, it's not collapsing. It's adapting. Sometimes in ways we can't fully see, which brings us back to the danger of opacity. What I find most striking is how quickly trust can erode once pain enters the picture. For decades, American companies built their margins on the back of Chinese efficiency. Now they're paying the price for putting too many eggs in one increasingly fragile basket. So what happens when economic pain meets political pressure? Next, we're going to look at the social side of this story, where unemployment, inequality, and protests may be the real pressure points Beijing fears most. What does unrest look like in a country where protests are not supposed to exist? Let's zoom in. In late 2022, a rare protest broke out at an iPhone factory in Zhengzhou. Workers clashed with guards over unpaid wages and strict lockdowns. The footage was chaotic. Angry voices, barricades torn down, hazmat suits everywhere. And yet, almost as soon as it surfaced, it disappeared from Chinese social media. But the discontent didn't. That protest was just the tip of the iceberg. China's youth unemployment quietly crossed 20% in mid-2023, and then, the government stopped publishing the data altogether. Think about that. Millions of college grads entering a workforce that's shrinking, and we don't even get to see the numbers anymore. What does that say? To me, it says fear, not fear of the West, fear of their own people. Historically, social instability has been Beijing's biggest nightmare. The memory of Tiananmen isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a guiding force in how the Chinese Communist Party governs. Any threat to stability, whether economic or ideological, is treated like a virus. Isolate, suppress, delete. But here's what's different today. This time, the anger is not coming from fringe dissidents or online activists. It's coming from workers, factory workers, delivery drivers, tech engineers who just got laid off. And here's where we can make a meaningful comparison. When the US hits a downturn, and we've had our fair share, we debate, we argue, we vote, maybe we protest, but those protests, at their best, are part of the democratic cycle. They're messy, yes, but they're visible, accountable, on the record. In China, it's the opposite. There is no open outlet, so tension builds underground. When a country hides its unemployment data and silences worker movements, it's not solving the problem. It's burying it. And that creates a pressure cooker effect. One spark, and things can blow up in ways nobody expects. I'll be honest, I don't think Beijing is about to collapse. But I do think they're walking a razor's edge. You can't have sustained economic pain without social consequences. Not forever. And if you're a global investor or a policymaker, or even just a concerned citizen, this is where the alarm bells should ring. Because it's not just about numbers anymore. It's about legitimacy, trust, and the social contract between the governed and the governing. And speaking of that social contract, let's now turn to the widening gap within China itself, not between the people and the party, but between those who have and those who don't. What if the real problem isn't what China exports, but what it can't consume? We often think of China as the world's factory, and rightly so. But when you look beneath the export numbers and the trade deals, something much more fragile starts to show. A broken engine at home. Let's talk about inequality. In cities like Shanghai or Shenzhen, you'll find gleaming skyscrapers, EV startups, and international luxury stores packed with customers. But take a train just a few hours inland, and it's a different story entirely. Aging factories, low consumer spending, and young people leaving for coastal cities because there's simply nothing left at home. This isn't just anecdotal. The income gap between urban and rural Chinese citizens is massive, roughly 2.5 to 1, according to official data. And that's just income. When it comes to access to healthcare, education, and even basic infrastructure, the disparity is even worse. Now here's the kicker. China talks a lot about dual circulation. The idea that the economy can rely more on domestic consumption rather than just exports. It sounds smart, but the truth is that shift hasn't happened. Consumption makes up only about 38% of China's GDP. Compare that to over 65% in the US. And that tells you something. Chinese citizens, especially the working class, simply don't feel safe enough to spend. There's no social safety net like Medicare or Social Security. If you get sick or lose your job, you're on your own. So instead of spending, people save, and save a lot. That's not a sign of confidence. That's a sign of fear. In my view, that fear reveals a deeper fragility. You can build bullet trains, AI labs, and offshore ports all day. But if the average person doesn't feel secure, if they're not participating in the growth, then that growth isn't sustainable. It's just window dressing. And here's something many Americans understand, especially those who lived through the 2008 crisis. Inequality isn't just unfair, it's unstable. When one part of the country lives in a bubble and the other part is drowning in debt, resentment builds. And resentment, left unaddressed, becomes dangerous. The challenge for China isn't just economic rebalancing. It's about rebuilding trust, creating a system where people feel invested not just as workers, but as citizens. And if they don't, then even small economic shocks, a tariff war, a housing slump, a pandemic, can tip the balance faster than anyone expects. Now, speaking of shocks, let's explore one more looming threat that's causing anxiety across the globe. What happens when China starts exporting its crisis in the form of cheap goods flooding the world economy? What if the world's next economic tremor doesn't start with a crash, but with a clearance sale? Let's talk about cheap goods. Not just bargain bin cheap, but prices so low they undercut entire industries. Because when China's economy stalls, history tells us it doesn't stay contained. In moments of internal slowdown, China often turns outward, flooding global markets with low-cost exports to keep its factories running and people employed. And that's not speculation. It's happened before. Back in 2015, when China faced a slowdown, steel prices collapsed globally. Chinese firms, backed by state subsidies, dumped excess steel abroad. Prices dropped over 50% in some markets. The result? American steel towns already hanging by a thread saw even more layoffs. Plants shuttered, families uprooted. And it's not just steel. From solar panels to aluminum to furniture, Chinese overcapacity, that is, producing more than the domestic market can absorb, has disrupted countless industries. And when prices nosedive, it's not just competitors who suffer. Entire ecosystems collapse. Suppliers, service workers, freight, insurance, it ripples. Now fast forward to today, with domestic consumption weak and manufacturing outpacing demand, those same dynamics are brewing again. We're already seeing signs. Excess inventory in sectors like EV batteries, solar components, and even machinery. If history repeats, these could hit US markets like a tsunami. I'll be honest, this part worries me the most. Not because American businesses aren't resilient, they are, but because unfair price competition doesn't give folks a chance. A small manufacturer in Ohio can't fight against a Chinese giant with state subsidies and no profit requirement. And when those small players fall, it's not just jobs we lose, it's innovation. It's community roots. It's the kind of diversified economy that makes us stronger, especially in tough times. Some might say, hey, cheaper goods help consumers. And that's partially true. But short-term savings often mask long-term costs. Shuttered factories, hollowed out towns, growing dependence on imports. I've seen that firsthand. The lesson here isn't just about trade policy, it's about values. Do we value a race to the bottom, or do we build toward resilience? where trade is fair, competition is balanced, and communities aren't crushed by invisible forces halfway across the world. And that brings us to the final part of this story. Because beyond the numbers, beyond the markets, there's something deeper at stake here. The bigger picture about power, transparency, and what it really means when a global giant starts to falter. Let's wrap this up with some perspective and a challenge in our final segment. If there's one thing this story has shown us, it's this. Even giants can crack when their foundation isn't built to last. We've seen how China's choice to hide economic data signals deeper trouble. When a government stops publishing the truth, it usually means the truth is inconvenient. We've looked at how unemployment and inequality aren't just numbers. They're fuel for unrest. We've seen how dumping cheap goods might seem like a win for consumers in the short term, but devastates the long-term strength of American small businesses and local economies. And perhaps most importantly, we've seen how transparency, balance, and resilience are not just buzzwords. They're the difference between sustainable prosperity and slow collapse. So what can we take away from all this? First, we need to stay informed, not just about what's happening at home, but about how fragile some of our biggest global relationships really are. Second, we need to support fair trade and demand accountability, not just from other nations, but from our own leaders who negotiate on our behalf. And third, we need to recognize that economic strength isn't just about stock markets or GDP. It's about people, families, workers, trust. If you've made it this far, thank you. You're not just watching, you're thinking, and that matters. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you seen signs like these before? Maybe in other countries or even here at home? Have you lived through the fallout of unfair competition or economic downturns? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because your voice matters in this conversation. And if you believe that America needs to stay alert, stay informed, and stay strong, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The world doesn't change because of what we know. It changes because of what we choose to do with it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.